The music had stopped hours ago, but its ghost clung to the rafters, thin as frost on iron, stubborn as a stain you could not scrub out. A girl with chapped hands and a braid too tight against her scalp dragged a stiff-bristled brush across the flagstones beneath the high table and watched water darken into old blood. She did not know all the names of the men whose boots had rested where her brush tugged now, only that they had been called guests and kingsmen and later meat. Her palm burned where the handle chewed at it. She pushed, rinsed, pushed again, and the color lifted into the slop bucket in clouded blooms. The way dye blooms from a bolt of cloth dropped too quickly into the vat. Outside the walls of the twins, fog lay in the river hollows and the towers rose like chimneys into a low, starless sky. The meat smell that had soaked into the beams in the hall, boar fat, bread crusts, the sour wet of spilled ale, had been joined to something coppersweet that made the kitchen girl breathe through her mouth. The speed with which the revel had soured into killing had left the room littered with the proofs of celebration. Overturned cups, a trencher of sugared almonds scattered like pale teeth near a broken lute. A garland of river flowers dropped across the rushes. She found a small embroidered badge caught under the leg of a stool, white with a red hand worked into it, someone's proud token. She slipped it into the pocket she had sewn inside her skirt, the one she kept for useful buttons and scraps of wax and things that might fetch a penny if the right man was in his cups. "Mind the step," one of the undercooks told her as he lugged a tub toward the corner where they stacked the sweepings. He had sausage grease under his nails and the wet in his eyes that comes from smoke. No one had slept. They had been set to their work as soon as the last scream thinned and the last blade was wiped. There were platters to clean and benches to scrub and trenches to use as kindling, because no fire ought to go hungry, not with so much of the night's business to burn away. The girl nodded and went on moving the brush. She had seen men die before. It was the Riverlands. You were born into water and mud and you grew up with the understanding that men came on horseback and took what they could chew, and sometimes what they could not. But there was a way things were supposed to be done. A dance you watched from the doorway and learned the steps of even if you never once set a foot on the floor. A guest puts his weapon beneath his cloak and eats and laughs and praises the bread. A host pours. Later, when a man leaves and when it is the river at his back and not a fire, then you may shoot arrows at him if you must, you may meet him in a field, you may do what men call necessary. Tonight had been something else. She tasted it in the water when she rinsed the brush. This stain did not want to let go. "Take the bucket," the undercook said when she had filled it for the 4th time. "Out back. Dump it by the midden. Mind the fog and don't kick the pigs." She took the yoke and set the buckets on it and went down the passage that led to the yard. The night pressed against the open door. The air smelled of damp stone and a rotting sweetness that reminded her of windfall apples left too long under the tree. The towers of the bridge were dim shapes. Lanterns had been hung along the walkways like a string of faraway suns. The river spoke below, slow and full. It had rained for 3 days before the wedding, and the waters were up. That was good for the mills. That was good for bargemen. That was bad for boys who strayed too near the bank with only a willow twig in their fist for luck. She tipped the buckets. The slops ran in a brief, thicker stream over the heap, then vanished into the drift of straw and peelings and bones. Something moved under there. Rats? Probably, or a dog. She kept her feet quick and light. No, not rats. Not just rats. She heard the rasp of a man's breath on his teeth. She froze, and the yoke nearly slid from her shoulder. "Hush," a voice said from the shadow that lay between the wall and the woodpile, and the word made the hairs rise along her forearms. A woman's voice. She had expected a stable boy or a carter trying to sleep where he could. This voice had a strange edge to it, like the chill edge of the iron when you draw your fingers too close to a blacksmith's fresh work. Not heat, but what the heat leaves behind. "Go back inside. Tell no one you saw me." The girl pressed her fists against her skirt. "I didn't see you," she said. It would have been clever to say it in a way that made it true. She had learned something of truth and its shapes by listening to the men who came through, to the oaths they swore and how quickly they undid them. But curiosity is a weed that grows stronger for being cut, and she could not help it. She raised her head and squinted. The woman had the sort of cloak that catches light in its folds. Too dark to be read, too rich to be the brown most sensible travelers chose. There was a gleam at her throat. A jewel? It could have been a brooch. It could have been a trick of the lantern on a drop of water. "You'll be missed," the woman said. "You don't want your mistress to count spoons and find you absent." "I don't belong to a mistress," the girl said. Quick. It was not wise to sound as if you belonged to no one. She hurried to add, "I belong to the kitchens, as does every good thing," the woman murmured, almost to herself. She turned her head slightly. Her hair fell smooth as grain poured from a sack. Only the kitchen girl, watching with a hunger for stories that had been starved by a summer of ugly ones, would have seen the moment when the woman held out her hand to the darkness beyond the woodpile and that darkness answered, slipping loose from itself in the shape of a man with a boatman's shoulders and a bundle slung against his side. The girl had seen shadows move wrong before, when the fog was thick and the torches low. She had a brother who told tales of the men who did things with shadows in cities that smelled of salt and hot stone. She had never thought to see the stories made ordinary by the stink of a midden and the sound of pigs snoring. "Tomorrow," the woman said, softer still, "before they think to flay him, before they think to put a wolf's head where a king's should be." The boatman made a sign with his fingers that the girl did not know. The woman's gem gleamed. "Tomorrow," she repeated, and the fog folded around them again. When the kitchen girl went back through the door into the hall, the air seemed too thick to pull into her lungs. She set the yoke down and thought very carefully of the next task in her work. The undercook said, "Where have you been?" And she said, "Dumping the buckets." And he nodded, and it was as if the words weighed enough to anchor her to the world again. In the towers, men laughed uneasily, the laughter of those who know they have made a bargain with their fear and do not trust it to be kept. Servants moved with their heads down and their mouths tight. Old Walder had called for blankets to be pulled over the bodies in the yard, not out of shame. No, but because he disliked the smell of the wet. He sat with a cup of mulled wine and prodded his grandchildren to sing the song with the rude verses. He was not so far gone in his satisfaction that he did not count. Didn't send a clever nephew to tally the dead and the living and the empty places in the straw, and to mark which corpses bore rings worth pulling. He felt a twinge in his hand where an old frostbite had left 2 fingers numb, and he cursed the north in his secret heart even as he congratulated himself for cutting it off at the roots. They had put the king in a lower room that had once been used for storing barrels of a sweet beer. It stank of yeast and of the iron of the chains that had once been used to lock the casks. They had not meant to be gentle with him. Men who feared would-be kings were never gentle once the would-be was taken away. But he had a mother who had screamed and scratched faces and left a line of blood along one man's cheek that would be a scar if he lived to have scars. And there had been a hush in the room when her throat was opened and her blood slid free with the terrible eagerness of all blood when it finds its path. Some of the hush was awe. Some of it was something each man would call by a different name if he dared call it anything. Remorse, unease, the sense that someone had blown out a candle in a house where other rooms still had doors open onto the same hallway. In the night, as Fog walked up from the river to stand beside the walls, the lower room held a steadier dark than the yard. The candles guttered twice and held. The king lay as if asleep, except that there was the slick on his chest where the cloak had stuck and been peeled from the wound, and the mask of gray on his lips, and the way his hands had stiffened into shapes more like tools than fingers. Someone had set what they thought was respect beside him, a jug of wine and a folded square of linen, and someone else had come along behind and taken the wine and left the linen. In such ways the living conduct their wars. When she came for him at last, it was not with a trumpeter or a fanfare. She was simply there, at the curve where the corridor turned, when the guards changed and the one going out was yawning and rubbing a streak of soot under his eye while the one coming in was busy thinking about the girl in the buttery who sometimes smiled. She did not glide. She did not do a sorceress's walk. She wore boots and they had mud on them. The man on the early watch blinked without seeing her and made a show of checking the buckle of his belt. The man on the late watch slid his tongue along his teeth to see if the crack in the third molar would catch and sting. The woman put her palm against each of their shoulders within a heartbeat of the other and said, "Wine in the yard," very softly. They turned away to look. There was no wine in the yard yet. There would be, though, because she had instructed a kitchen boy to carry a skin and to trip at the top of the steps. The boy would pretend to be mortified and would pick himself up, and his ears would ring with curses, and he would think only of keeping off the swing of someone's hand for long enough to be forgotten. In that moment she passed between the guards and the doorway, and the smell of the yeast rose to meet her like old breath. She had wished for a brazier. Fire would have made the room's stories easier to read. She did not always need fire to know a room, but she liked it. Fire prickled the world's hide and made it shiver. You could see the thread beneath when it twitched like that. On the floor the body lay. They had stripped him of his doublet. It lay folded with unexpected care on a barrel head. The gray of it stained darker near the sleeve where some man's hands had rested too long before pulling it away. The woman paused there. She lifted the edge of the cloth and let it fall. She did not reach to touch the young man's shoulder, the way a mother or a wife might have reached, even with fear like a live thing in her throat. She stood and looked and drew breath once, deep, as if she drank in the room with him in it. They call it king's blood, she thought, and they are right and they are wrong. Blood is blood. The ocean is the ocean whether you give it a grand name or not. But there are tides and swells and tricks of wind that make one portion of sea more dangerous than another at a given hour. And so too there is some blood that the fire will leap toward as if at a lover's call. She had not seen this one in her flames until tonight. Not clearly. In flicker and smoke, there were always wolves. There was always a cold that seemed to breathe on the back of her neck. The crowned figure had not shown her his face. He had stood with the rein on his hair and his hands open, and she had not known whether the crown was iron or shadow or mercy. She took the chain from around her throat and let the jewel rest against the back of her hand. It pulsed once, a small beat, like something alive caught in a net. She knelt. The floor was damp through the wool of her gown. She smelled the young man's sweat, the echo of it, more than the thing itself, and the stink that comes when fear leans through the last seconds of life and leaves its trace. She laid her palm lightly above his heart. There was no answering tap beneath. The skin was cool. He had bled enough to feed the floor. Around his wrist, a thin line showed where a cuff had pressed and been removed. She had seen daughters of kings with wrists like that, innocent as rope burn. "You were late," a voice said inside her, but that was only the part of her that came from a place where the moon drenched stones with something that was not quite light, and women learned to weave what drank you if you stared too long. She ignored it as she had learned to do. She had come across mud and marsh with a man who did not ask questions and a boat. And she had fed the fire on the riverbank with the last of the resins she'd hoarded. And she had watched the flames throw up pictures that were the same and different each time. A boy with his hair in his eyes. An old man whose laugh was a cough. A bear who ate a boy's foot in a winter when other food was gone. A sword in a place the sea should not be. Always the cold. Always. Tonight, the faces had parted and there had been this boy man with blood on his sleeve, and the cold around him had hesitated in a way the cold did not often do. Hesitation is an opening. She had learned that almost too late to use it. With the back of her knuckles she touched the scar that would live on the boy man's chest if he had continued to be a boy long enough to have scars. It was not clean. Men in armor who knew where to stick a blade did not always make a neatness of it. It had been a short blade, she saw, with a slender point that slipped between ribs and tasted heart. The heart itself, she closed her eyes and saw the big muscle slack in darkness. Slack like a net when the fish have slipped out. She had not done this before. Others in her order had worked pretend miracles for men who wanted to see a trick. She had spent herself on shadows. She had killed with what she made. She had burned leeches because burning was both easy and terrible, and men liked terrible from a woman who smiled when they were brave enough to ask. But she had seen a drunken priest put his mouth on a dead man's mouth and drag him back like a rug being pulled. She had despised him for his sloppiness, and she had been stung by the knowledge that he had not even meant to. Light sometimes turned where it pleased. She asked no leave. She spoke no words to the silent room about law or hospitality or the names of the men who had ordered the thing. None of that had ever persuaded a fire to leap. She lifted the jewel again and let it rest against her sternum. It was less than a heartbeat now, more like a steady warmth. The way a bakehouse wall gives back the day's heat in the evening when you walk past and think briefly that you are loved. She bared his chest entirely, and the skin along her cheek pebbled with the chill. She took a blade from her sleeve, small and curved, like a smile, and cut her own palm. Quick, before she could pretend she needed ritual for it. Her blood slid, bright even here, and the air's fat smells flattened under the iron of it. She put that blood where his had been and set her other hand atop his breastbone. She had thought, once, when she first understood what the man by the river did, that the kiss was the trick of it, that it was the mouth and the breath and the warmth that entered by the narrowest door. That man had believed as much. She knew better. Breath is only one way in. She bent anyway. She put her mouth to his and tasted the sourness of a man left too long without tending. She did not let her mind slide away from the unpleasantness of it. Charm is useful. Disgust has teeth. She gave him her breath, once, twice, and she felt the world narrow to the width of that exchange. She had known hunger. She had known the straightness of thirst. Neither was like this. The giving of breath became an ache in her throat where it seemed there was less of her each time. The room tilted. Her hands trembled. She caught the edge of the world with the points of her teeth and held on. "Come," she said, not with her tongue, which had grown too clumsy, but with a part of her that had more often said, "Go." The room stayed a room, square and stale-smelling and close. The jewel did nothing showy. The fog outside rubbed against the wall. A lantern creaked on its bracket. She bent and she breathed and she pushed with hands and blood and that stubborn thing in her that believed in the usefulness of this boy man's return, not because it would satisfy a man she counseled. Not even because it would please the God in whose name she counseled him. Gods did not please. Gods burned and burned. But because the cold had paused near him in her fire and she had felt a thread you could put a nail through. She sought that thread now in this room and knew, with an odd sensation of embarrassment, that she had thought herself more skilled at finding than she turned out to be. "Come," she insisted, and there was an answering lurch, the kind that disarranges a moment, like thinking of someone and having them walk through the door as if you'd pulled them by a cord. She felt the faintest tremor under her palm. She stilled her body with effort, the way a hunter does when the deer's ear twitches. She did not move. She waited, and the tremor came again. He was not aware of the floor or the ceiling or the fog or the woman. He was aware of a weight, which is not the same thing as a body. He was aware of the habit of being accustomed to a body, which is different again. There was dark, and past the dark a sound like wind and grass, and past that the sense more notion than understanding. That there is a place you are meant in, like a place at a table or a place in a bed between a mother's arms and the pillow. He could have drifted. He could have spun where the absence had thinned around him into a sort of river with no banks and no need to cross it. There had been an argument at some point. Someone saying a thing with such seriousness that the words had made a stone weight in his stomach even after the laughter. There had been a wet heat at his chest. He had lifted his hand with an absurd concern for the stain he would make on his sleeve, and then he had been lying, and then the sound had gone to a single long knife edge, like steel drawn down a whetstone. He remembered his mother's hair in his hands when he was small and had tried to braid it and made a bird's nest of it. And she had laughed and said he would cut his fingers on it if he weren't careful. He remembered a great warm breath at his shoulder that had not been human, and a heartbeat that had matched his at night when he lay with his hand flung across the rough fur and spoke nonsense to the dark because he was young enough to believe that nonsense said in safety could not harm you. He had thought the door would be there. Before the dark had closed, he had thought someone would open a door and take him by the wrist and lead him somewhere he had no right to go but could not refuse. He felt now the tug on his wrist, except it was his chest instead, and the hand was hot and insistent and did not care whether he had made promises to anyone else. There was a noise. He was irritated by the idea of the noise because it meant he was not done with noise. He wanted a last silence. He wanted to stop keeping his voice low when he should have raised it and stop raising it when he should have chewed his words thoughtfully and swallowed the bitter ones. He concentrated on irritation because it was easier than thinking whether anything else might be there. The woman's breath passed into his mouth, warm and precisely measured. She counted without counting. The boatman behind her shifted his weight from foot to foot the way men do when they have agreed to witness something and then find they cannot keep still. She did not ask him again for help. The bargain had been made. He had rowed her upriver against the current and through a tangle of willow roots that had brushed at their sleeves like pleading hands. This was not his part. The tremor became a twitch. She felt it in the tendons beneath his skin, not in the quiet meat of the heart, whose sulkiness made her want to dig her thumb into it the way you dig your thumb into the side of a loaf that refuses to rise. "Come," she said again, and heard the dangerous edge in her own voice. She would not beg. Begging made you give too much weight to the listener. She pressed and breathed and let a remembered tale of sand and midday heat and a boy with thirst so acute he had cried once as a child, only once, and then never again, float above the grind of her own body's protest. She thought of other times she had waited for a proof she did not deserve to be granted and had been granted anyway. She thought of the way men's faces changed when they realized the thing they were afraid of had already happened. He gasped. It was not a breath. It was a refusal. It was the body's refusal to continue not being a body. It left him wrung and raw. He opened his lips wider on instinct and air rushed into him, as if he were a bellows and someone downstairs had decided to light the morning's fire after all. Pain announced itself promptly and without apology. He was the sort of man who had known pain in the way that increasing boys on horses know it. Bruises and the slice of a blade that had not gone deep and the sore, bright spots left by a fever that would pass. This was different. This was a hand gripping his belly and his chest at once and twisting and demanding to know whose fault it was. He coughed because his throat wanted to. He curled toward the sensation because his ribs demanded that. And he hit the limit of what the rest of his body could do and stopped altogether because the world had become very small and was full of an iron taste that made him think of the time he had put his tongue on a bit of battered mail at 12 to see if the cold would make it stick. Air hurt. Life hurt. Being retrieved hurt. He remembered, in a clean slide of understanding through the grit, that retrieval was a thing thieves and brothers did. The woman who had set her mouth to his tore herself back with care before he bit her and set her hands so she could push him over onto his side without his struggling body sliding too far. She looked away while he retched. She had been at birthings. She had been at really bad deaths. There are noises that require no audience. She let him make them and said nothing, and when he clawed toward his chest with his left hand, she slapped it lightly. A correction. And then she set his fingers where they would do no harm and moved no further. The horse memory arrived in him like light through a crack. He had always known where he was in relation to a horse. He had known when a horse would shy a heartbeat before it shied. He had felt his people's eyes on his back when he rode away and his people's eyes on his back when he rode toward them again. He had known the size of those eyes, the greed and the hope and the resentment in them, and he had tried to carry it as if it weighed less than it did, so they would not be tired for loving him. He had known a wolf whose soul had come into the world beside his and had been told by men with years behind them and women with the kind of gentleness that is worse than a slap that this wolf was only a wolf, not a neighbor, and he had nodded because Respect. Tea for elders sits in the bones in the north as early as walking. He gasped once more, and when the body memory of the stab returned, clear as ice in a cup, he went stiff and still, and more of the cold world came back with the stiffness. The banners and the bread in his uncle's unblinking, deliberate eyes, and the first arrow, and the second, and the sound his mother made that he would never forgive the world for demanding of her. The woman did not offer him forgiveness or consolations. She asked nothing of him that he could not give and did not force him to hear what he could not bear. When the worst of the first passing shook him out and left him like the shore after a storm, he lay and breathed. She could see the small movements between his ribs now, stubborn, the way a child breathes evenly to show that he is done with crying and does not need to be held when he does. She moved to the corner where someone had left a jug and she sniffed it. Not wine, water, and stale. Better stale than none. She brought it to him and held it to his mouth. And he tried to drink and choked and then drank properly and closed his mouth on the rim as if he intended never to allow anything as feeble as a breath to escape him again. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice had no purr in it, no trick. It might as well have been a wooden thing placed in the room for their use. A chair, a stool, a sturdy knife. "We must go." He rolled one eye to look at her. There were bits of them in everything still out of order, eyes and breath and the set of his mouth and what he remembered of what a word like must meant. He blinked slowly. He tried to shape something like an inquiry. He found the part of him that had learned to make inquiry a command and tried not to be ashamed that it was right there to be found. "Go," he managed, and there was blood on his lip where a cracked skin had broken. He had not the distance from himself yet to be embarrassed that the word had been a croak. Hunger bit him unexpectedly, a wild dog's snap, Not for food. You cannot want food during the first hour of a return. The body has objections that come before food, but for something to lean his head on, that was not an idea. The floor was hard. The floor said, "You are alive, and if you are alive you may be hurt, and if you may be hurt you must move." He tested his hands. One felt as if it had been slept on too long. Pins and needles pricked it to life. The other ached down through the forearm into the wrist where the narrow bones made their own rules. "Now," the woman said, "before they think to do what they will want to brag elsewhere about doing. Before they go looking." She had not told him what hour it was in the keeping of the world because that information would not be useful to him as he was. She had not told him her name. Names had a way of becoming too significant when men were newly born to pain. He would try to hang his weight on one, and that would slow him in the wrong places. He set his elbow beneath him and moved. The movement was a map, and he traveled it in small steps, none of which could be called dignified, all of which had their necessity. He sat up with the wall at his back, and his chest said a feral word that had no equivalent in any tongue a man uses at court. He set his feet flat and found his knees. He waited between each discovery to see if the body he had been reclaimed for intended to confess to any other damage. It confessed to bruises, to a deep hurt where the blade had gone in, to the fact that you cannot die and return and expect not to find that your pulses have learned a new song. He felt them in his wrists, a strange syncope, as if a drum had lost a drumstick and learned to keep time with a fire poker. The boatman moved then, gently as a man who has spent his life with ropes and things that tangle. He held out an arm. Robb, though he did not think of his name yet as if it belonged in his own mouth. The rooms in him where names were kept were still shuttered, took the offered steadiness and let himself be hauled to his feet with just enough assistance that his pride did not see it as a shame. The room swam. The woman steadied his head with her hand, a touch like the back of a spoon on a baby's temple. He gritted his teeth until he could let go. "We will go by water," the woman said. "It is noisy here. Water is quieter." He might have laughed some other time. Everyone knows water is not quiet. It tells you a story the whole while you are with it. But he did not argue. Water meant something to be carried by, and that seemed possible. Walking meant insult, and he was tired of being insulted. They wrapped him in a cloak that had belonged to a man who would not complain of its loss. The fabric fell heavy around him, smelled of damp wool and a ghost of the other man's tobacco. The boatman supported him at one side. The woman changed the set of her shoulders by the fraction that makes a person look like someone else. It was an old trick, and she had used it often enough that it drew no notice from her. Like a musician's finger finding the right placing without the eye's help. They went by the way she had come, a corridor where the stone had been rubbed smooth along one hand's height by people who had leaned there and told each other a bit of rumor. Then a narrow stair that made his knees protest and that spread a sweetness of panic in his belly until he wrestled it into obedience and called the feeling something else. Anger, perhaps, or the memory of anger. And then the yard, where fog pressed down like a thumb bent at the first joint and lanterns were too few. They passed near the kitchen door. The girl stood there with her brush leaned against the jamb and her braid coming loose. She saw the boatman's shoulder and the set of the woman's head and the figure between them with the cloak clasped badly and the feet that did not land like a well man's feet. She kept her lips shut and her eyes half-lidded and looked past tea. Hemmed toward the midden as if rabbits interested her more than an odd trio where there ought not to be one. When they were gone into the fog, she sat down on the doorstep and put her hand over her breast for a count of 10. Then she stood up again and went back into the hall and dipped her brush and held the voice that wanted to run out into the yard to climb the stair and shout alive, alive, alive like a bird that has escaped a snare. The river had gathered itself up under the arches. It slapped at the pilings in a steady rhythm, and then, when a larger surge of water came down from where the mill run emptied, it would lift and scuff as if someone had set their hand flat against it and nudged. The boat was the sort men use for short work, thick-bottomed, with sides high enough to feel safe and low enough to make stepping in and out of it without a dance possible. The boatman had greased the thwarts with a bit of animal fat so that the creak of wood would be less. He had tucked his oars into the reeds and he pulled them out now with so gentle a motion that it made the woman think of a fisherman in a story, luring a creature to the surface with his patience. He helped the young man into the boat without a clumsy bump against the gunwale. It was the sort of detail the woman would remember later when she searched for what to be grateful for and what thread to pull to keep a day from unraveling. The oars took the water and the river did its part. The fog gave them a wall against the notice men might have turned their heads to. The woman's lungs worked like a bellows still in the wake of the work she had done, and her limbs were both too light and too heavy, as if someone had pumped her full of bees and then asked her to wade through honey. She sat in the stern and looked back once at the towers. There were points of light where the lanterns hung. There was a high window with a curtain that stirred as if a hand had drawn it aside a finger's width. She let the boatmen set their course only by the sound of the water and that trickle of current lore men who have never been fathers pass, as if it were a story about a woman told with care. They went downriver at first, because men who look for runaways look upriver, and because downstream meant away from the habit a place has of holding the shape a thing makes in it even after the thing has gone. The young man lay half-propped against a bundle of netting and the cloak they had taken for him. He turned his head toward the bow and listened to the water. It told him one story. You live. It told him the other story too. You will pay for it. You have questions, the woman said after a while, when the ache in her throat had become ordinary enough to ignore the way you ignore the tightness of a new boot. Yes, he said, though the words scraped him. Save them, she said, without unkindness. You're not strong enough to be angry yet, and questions are anger in their shirt sleeves. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if there had been less iron in it, and then he shut his mouth because his teeth had begun to chatter. He could not tell whether the shaking came from cold or from the thing that had been done to him. They reached the shelter of a low island, a tongue of mud with willows along its spine that kept off the worst of the wind and made a ruffle in the current where fish paused and gathered their concentration. Here the boatman dug his oar into the bank and steadied them, and the woman stepped out and took the little brazier she had wrapped in cloth so no curious light would blow their cover, and set it on the patch of bare sand that offered itself between the roots. She fed it with what small, dry drift there was. The flame rose and settled and sent up a thread of smoke that was only barely darker than the fog, though to her eye it burned vivid and particular. The jewel against her throat had settled. It lay there like a stone on a grave. She warmed her hands and then she took them away and let the heat be for him. He reached for it like a plant. He had been a northern boy with a northern tolerance, but this cold came from inside him. He turned his palms toward the brazier and closed his eyes and his mouth. The fingers that had been called clever by his father when he held reins, that had been admired for their steadiness when he took a boar spear, shook and then steadied and then shook again like a man mastering a fear of heights. "What did you do?" he asked when the shaking let him own his voice. "Breathed," she said. She did not smile at her own simplicity. "Push back. Open a door that was not locked. The harder question is why." "Why?" he said, his mouth around the word as if he had not spoken it in years. "Because I saw a thing I preferred to this river without you in it," she said. It was not an answer he expected. He had expected something about kingdoms and gods. She did not deprive him of those either. She pointed to the brazier. "Have you thought of what the river will hold if the cold goes unstopped? Men think of ice as a cleanliness. It is only a blankness. Blankness will take your sisters and your children. Blankness will take your dogs and your old and your songs. Fire remembers." She rubbed her thumb against her palm where the cut had closed with a reluctant sting. Her blood had clotted almost too quickly. She would have preferred the pain to last a little longer. It would have given her something to pay. He listened and watched her face the way he had once watched the line of a ridge where he expected deer to break. He did not trust faces. He had trusted too many. His mother's face had twisted. He did not want to think of that. He let it sit like a stone at the bottom of his attention. He would have to lift it when he had hands to spare. "What is your name?" he said instead. She considered whether to lie, not because a lie would matter in any deep place, not the kind of lies that are clumsy when you are tired, but because names unlocked assumptions. He would hang them on her shoulders and she would have to bear them while she bore other compromises. But he would hear someone else say her name before the day was out. Best to choose her own giving. "Melisandre," she said. His mouth made a shape as if it tried to fit that into a language he knew. He had the decency not to ask her where she came from. She looked at him and thought of the stories told about him by men who had not been there and by men who had and by women who collected stories for their value in feeding the kind of talk that buys you an extra bowl of stew in a winter kitchen. She thought of the smell of the room where she had laid her mouth on his, and of the way her hands had ached even before she had put them on him, as if they knew more than she did of what would be required. She thought of Stannis Baratheon sitting with the stubbornness all the Baratheons had shared among themselves and the certainty he had borrowed from her. The certainty she had given him in return for his stubbornness when nothing else in this country had seemed as if it might hold. He had the look a man has when he's using the exact amount of energy needed and no more, because there is no more to use. He said her name again, slower, and said, "I am," and paused because the word he had was a title, and the title had been torn off him in the presence of men who had kept the ugly phrase the Lannisters taught the world. The one where a grace is a jug you pour and someone else decides whether to drink. "Robb," he said, and then he had to shut his eyes because that name came attached to too much. To a father's hand on his shoulder, to the deep animal knowing of his wolf, to a woman he had wedded because goodness had outrun cunning one night when cunning would have served him better. He did not know yet whether that goodness would betray him a second time. He had the chivalrous impulse to be ashamed of such a thought. He let it slide past him. He did not have space for chivalry in this moment. "Robb is enough," Melisandre said. She did not reach to touch him again. She wanted to. She wanted, in a way that surprised her, to set her hand on his hair and feel the warmth of his scalp and know that the thing she had dragged back would stay. It was not how she had meant to come here. She had not meant to feel for him separate from what he would be useful for. She was tired enough to find herself sentimental. It was dangerous. Sentiment softened the edges you needed when you cut through the world. The boatman cleared his throat. He had not said a word since he'd helped them out of the boat. His voice when he used it had the odd gentleness of large men who have seen what noise can do in the wrong place. "There's a place I know up a side channel," he said. "Been a boathouse once. Roof's half down and the oak door goes to rot if you look at it long enough. But it's a place to be with no eyes on it that shouldn't. You'll want a place." Melisandre nodded. She looked at Robb. "He's right." Robb swallowed. His throat had begun to recall itself to him, the way a limb gone numb begins to throb as it returns. He wondered about the men who would be counting and whether they would count right. He wondered about the man whose hand had pressed the blade into his chest, whose words had been delivered with family. He did not let himself repeat those words. He had a fear that if he put them in his mouth, he would never stop tasting their shape. And even now, with the fog wrapping and the fire small, honest heat on his face, he feared becoming a man defined by one sentence. He pushed himself to his knees and then to his feet. The world teetered. His stomach did an aggrieved twist. He mastered both. He said, because he could not help himself, "My mother was brave," Melisandre said, "was fierce." She did not say the rest. He knew the rest. She saw the knowledge move across his face and set in the corners of his mouth, that harshness older men's mouths have. She did not care whether he blamed her for the way she told him. The long cruelty of a story told badly is worse than the sharp cruelty of a story told plain. She did not think there would be comfort in either. He held himself still until the shaking came, then until it concluded, and then he nodded once to the boatman. It was a manners gesture, not a king's. Melisandre filed the change away for later. Some part of her that had never liked the rigidity of kings found the bowman's nod more promising. The side channel slid out of the river's main braid like a secret mouth into a second mouth. The kind children tell each other about in whispers when they are supposed to be sleeping. The willows leaned low. The boatman shipped his oars and pushed with a pole, feeling under the water as careful as a blind man's hand over a stranger's face. They did not speak. Melisandre let the flames in the small brazier, covered now, its lid cracked to show one thin seam of orange light, count the beats of the dark. Robb watched the shock of white when a heron lifted and beat away. He thought of his wolf and forced himself to look down at his hands. It is a mistake to stand in one thought and bolt the door. Better to walk through a progression of rooms as if you were a guest in a house owned by an enemy, and always to notice the window. The boathouse was a squat shape against the bank. Once it had had a trim that made it seem less of a box and more of a place. The trim had gone to feed men's stove fires last winter. The door did indeed look as if it would give way if you breathed the wrong direction. The boatman shouldered it, and it sighed and sagged and admitted them. The air inside had the smell of old damp and the mournful sweetness of wood that once had been cared for. There was a bench built into the wall. There were rusty nails where someone had hung nets long ago and forgotten to come back for them. Melisandre swept her hand through the cobweb at shoulder height and felt the cobweb stick to her skin. She did not flinch. The brazier, when she uncovered it, threw its light up along the curve of the beams and showed them the wasps nestled and abandoned there, paper-thin and the color of an old man's fingernails. "Here," the boatman said, and did not apologize for the poor quality of the hospitality he offered. He fetched a bundle from under the forward thwart, one he had packed with the sort of pride that belongs to men who are not asked to pack the important things, and he folded a blanket and then a second into a pallet. Robb sat as if his bones had decided for him. Melisandre set the brazier near his feet and then moved it a little farther, mindful of sparks and old wood. The lattice of light ran over Robb's shins and the ruff of the blanket and the boatman's hands. "I have to leave you," the boatman said. "The boat being gone will say as much as anything. They'll have men asking about men who were seen on the water at odd hours. I'll be seen, and that's better." He scooped his cap up from where he had dropped it and twisted it once between thick fingers. He was not a man who thought of himself as bound to kings. He was a man who thought of himself as bound to this river. The river had accepted what they had brought it tonight without a ripple. He would repay the favor by obeying its habits. Melisandre nodded. She did not bless him. He would have expected it to come with a price. She said, "Go by the low mill. There is a woman there who owes me 2 loaves. Take them on the morrow." "She owes you?" the boatman said, a smile twitch breaking from the edge of his mouth. "She owes the woman whose child I turned so the cord wouldn't strangle him," Melisandre said. The boatman's smile died. He had seen what strangling did. He made his nod and he was gone. Robb and Melisandre were alone in the boathouse, and the flame said all the small, ordinary things a flame says when it is not required to act as a messenger of a god. "I eat. I am. I will make this place what it is not if you feed me, and I will leave it what it was if you do not." "You should sleep," Melisandre said, and Robb thought this an absurd suggestion because he was wide awake in every nerve. But his body knew better than his mind. He slid from sitting toward lying and caught his breath where the wound made itself important. He set his hand lightly to his chest and let the pain be something to mark his place by, the way a sailor sets the stars in their positions in his head to know one night from another. Melisandre watched him the way a woman watches a kettle to catch the exact moment it boils. When the long breath came that said sleep had taken him by the ankle and tugged him into itself, she let her own head fall back against the beam and closed her eyes. She did not dream in pictures anymore. She dreamed in heat, in gradations of warmth as subtle as a weaver's gradations of color. She dreamed of the far places where the wind had a taste of metal, cold not like night's chill on a river, but like the inside of a closed fist. She dreamed of the girl-child whose mouth had been set to a particular stubbornness since she learned to put a stick in a stream and feel the push, and of the white dog that walked near her. She dreamed of a boy on a wall made of old ice, and of the man she had come with across the rough water, his jaw clenched even when he slept because he had not learned how to let his own weight be held. She dreamed of wolves, always wolves, and she dreamed once of a red leaf turning slowly in clear water. Robb's sleep was the sort that has no mercy. It was a hammering, not a drifting. The body he had been dragged back into chose what it wanted from the store of boyhood, chose what it had to have now that it had gone without for a terrible interval. He lay and he sweated, not with the fever that has purpose, but with the skin's animal attempt to right itself. He dreamed of his father and of the way men had looked at his father as if there were a straight line you could draw between the man and the good. He dreamed of roads. He dreamed of the smell of crushed pine needles. He dreamed of bread torn in halves and of how small his hands had looked in a woman's lap once, when he put them there without shame in a time before shame knew his name. He dreamed, inevitably, of the haul and the arrow and the blade. The dreams changed it. The arrow came from somewhere it had not. The blade chose a different rib. This is what dreams do. They try to metalwork sorrow into something either more ornamental or more lethal. He woke with the slow dread of pain already present and the new dread of figuring out what to do with his eyes and his breath and his flat need to reverse time. Melisandre had been awake before him. She had been sitting on the bench with the jewel unhooked and rolled back and forth in her palm. She looked at him and found, to her surprise, that she felt relief and a small, unworthy pride. She had wanted this to work, not only because of what he would be useful for, but because doing it had been a famous idea when it had been the drunk priest's accident, and because some envy is as honest as hunger. She curled her fingers around him and set her hands against her knees and said, "You will be hungry." He was. It came like a slap. It was an affront. It seemed indecent that after breath and pain and lost the body should make an appallingly ordinary request. He swallowed and nodded, and she took from beneath the bench a wrapped parcel that smelled faintly of onion, bread, the last of it from the boatman's stores, and a heel of a cheese so ripe it would have pleased even a northern palate. She cut with the small knife and handed him a piece. He bit, and it startled him. It always startled a returned man. How good the rough of bread against the mouth can be. How life hides its pleasures and textures when a man is preparing elaborate appetites that go unfulfilled. When the food had sunk into him and eased some of the raggedness, he nodded almost without meaning to. The motion tugged at the skin where the wound lay. He clenched and then let go. "You serve Stannis Baratheon," he said, because questions waited their turn, and this one had stood quietly with its hands folded till the end and deserved a place. "I counsel him," Melisandre said. "He heeds me when he thinks it is his idea." A flicker of humor sped across her mouth like heat shimmer. "I serving no man. I serve fire." "And fire," he said, looking at the brazier's mild glow as if he might find a face in it. He had grown up with gods whose faces were leaves and deer, and the blunt old understanding of the North that the world is itself and you can put a name to it if you want and it won't much care. Melisandre's certainty made him cautious. "Fire wants me alive. Fire wants what stands against the cold," she said. "You are a piece on that board. There's weight in the piece that was you. Men will move when it moves." He tried to take the measure of the insult in being called a piece. He found none. He had called men pieces when he had sent them toward a river ford and hoped the river would not take them. He had told a boy with milk on his lip to hold a holding for an hour no one would remember if they survived. He had thought himself the hand moving the pieces. He had not been so very wrong. He had also not been so very right. He could feel that now the way you feel a bruise under your sleeve when someone pats your arm. "What do you want of me?" he said, and did not make it a challenge because he didn't have the breath for a challenge that would demand her pride come out dressed for war. "To stand," she said, "to heal, to see with the eyes you didn't use before because there were too many men telling you what men do and not enough telling you what men cost. To be what you are anyway, with fewer mistakes if possible." She tilted her head and measured the truth in offering more then. She chose not to. She did not tell him that she would use him to pry open the North for a man he had not bent a knee to. She did not tell him that the faces in her flames sometimes arranged themselves into a boy with a sword that burned and that she could not tell whether the light came from the blade or the boy. She did not tell him that she had seen a corpse with a girl's long hair lifted from a river and a mouth that remembered singing. He lifted his hand and looked at it. The lines in his palm were the same as they had been before, and that seemed wrong, as if the world should have run some new track into him to mark where he had gone. The wound that lay beneath the cloak and bandage ached with an odd rhythm, as if it were considering its options. He thought of names. Fry, Bolton, Karstark, Lannister. Names make a net. He set them aside. He thought of people. His mother, his father, his foster father with the careful voice and the haunted look after war. The girl he had married. The girl he had promised to marry. His sisters whose faces tumbled in his mind, and for one long, indecently long moment he could not fit either face to Arya's name, and the idea that grief had eaten even that made him put his hand flat against the bench and press as if pressure could force memory's teeth to bite down. "She may live," Melisandre said. He did not jerk, but the change in how he held his head was as sharp as if she had struck him. She had not meant to offer that. The vision had been flicker, not assurance. The risk lay in hope. Men do much because of it and more because they are denied it. She was not above the sin of wanting to be thanked. She swallowed that and went on, because the only good thing about certain sins is how easily they feed the fire. There is a girl. There are two. One is caught in a net of manners. One walks a road where men die in ditches. I do not think the cold has its hand on either yet. It does not feel like the river when a body goes under and you know that's that. He held very still, and the pain of holding still was preferable to the pain of reaching with his attention toward pictures that might vanish when he closed his fist. And my Winterfell. Fire told me a thing that might be a lie, she said, careful. Stone is patient. Stone remembers men. Stone will outlast you if you let it, but it is also a thing men can climb. I saw children in the bones of a house, eating from bowls as if the house had never been a house and had always been a cave. I saw a boy who dreamed of a door that wanted him dead, and a boy who dreamed of snow that did not want him anything at all, only wanted to be snow. She did not say names. She watched the way his mouth tightened and loosened like a fist. He took that and put it somewhere in himself that was not yet raw. He would come back to it and pick it up and look at what it was made of when his hands weren't trembling. He reached for the cup and drank the last of the water, and then looked at the brazier as if warming his hands on it again might be an apology for thinking hard things about a woman who had done a hard thing in his favor. They'll come, he said. Frey's men, Bolton's, the lions if they hear. They'll come to see if I'm not where they left me. They will look, Melisandre agreed. She stood. She had the stiffness everywhere that comes after the hour you let your body sit with its anger. She rolled her shoulders and felt the fatigue sit down heavily in them again, as if it had been waiting for her to acknowledge it before it became obedient. That's why we go away from where they expect the road to be. There is a woman in a fallen mill who owes me loaves. There is a ruined sept where a beetle lets me sleep when I tell him a story about a saint who was only a man afraid of the dark. There are ways. She placed the jewel around her throat again and set it so that it lay where it did what it did simply by being a thing that drew the eye when she wished. It became a thing the eye passed over when she did not. And there are men who mean to tell me my business. I will use their anger to light their way and lead them off it. He swung his feet to the floor and stood again to test standing. The first time you rise after dying is an argument. Your nature presents you with evidence that lying down is safer. You contradict it with the dumb assertion of someone who cannot bear to be corrected. He held the wall and waited. He said, not to her, no swords. It came out of his mouth in the tone a boy uses when he discovers a thing and is pleased with his cleverness despite it being obvious. No swords, she agreed. It is not the sort of fight for swords. Those come later, when you can go an hour without the world turning to water when you turn your head. He smiled. There was nothing sweet in the smile. It was simply an acknowledgement that someone had spared him from wrecking himself on his own pride in this minute. He looked at the boatman's blanket and the bench and the brazier and the door and the bit of daylight that had found its way through a split in the roof. Time had moved while he had slept. Morning had the white in it that comes after a night of fog. Things would stand out soon with the sharp cruelty of stones round a field when the frost has gone but winter has not. They did not go at once. Leaving at once would have been clever. They did not do what clever men who love their cleverness too much do. They waited the extra time for the kitchen side of the house of Fry to boil water and pour it over grain, and for the servants to eat the first bowls with their heads down from shame and fatigue. They left at the hour when men who sit up all night begin to believe in the permission of dawn. The river had lost its wrap of fog and lay with its back bare and shiny. The boatman had not returned, but he had done what he could and removed any sign of their coming. Melisandre made Robb look her in the eye and waited to see if his pupils were the right size. They were off, of course. Return does that. But they were not the wrong sort of off. She nodded. They stepped into the boat. The day moved around them. They traveled. Men passed on other boats, woodcutters. A boy with the slack face of someone who had learned a simple task and been kept to that task for years. 2 soldiers with their tabards tied up and the shame of being seen in their lord's colors after what had been done to guests still damp on their tongues. Melisandre looked at them with a woman's face that was unremarkable but for the jewel, and they looked away. Robb kept his head down. He was not yet a man to whom the world owed notice. He was a man in a cloak. They put in at a bank where the alders stood with their toes in the water. They lay in the long grass and the wind came under it and made a sound like women's skirts at a distance. The kind that makes a boy's heart rise into his throat with hope and the first knowledge that some hopes take you into trouble. Robb slept again. His body had not asked his permission to gather what strength it could. Melisandre ate a hard pear she had taken from the pack and gave him a bite when he woke, because pears go to the root of the mouth, which is where you should remind a returned man that sweetness is possible. She folded the brown core into her palm and tossed it into the river and watched it spin and run and become flotsam equal to any man's crown. They turned off the river where the boatman had suggested and came up along a ditch that stank the way ditches do. A woman with a basket looked at them and spat, because it is not wise to let all the things you want sit against your teeth. Melisandre recognized her, though she had not expected to. She had been thinner last time. Hunger remakes faces. The loaves, Melisandre said. The woman made a noise that was refusal, then looked at Robb's posture. Not the face. Not yet. She had not lifted her eyes that far, and something in it made her search her basket and bring out 2 breads tied up in a cloth they could return to a woman who had fewer than she did. Robb broke one open while it was still warm from the oven down the lane, and the steam came up and he held it under his face and let himself be crude about it. The woman looked at him again, and her eyes widened the small amount a cautious person permits her eyes, and she set her mouth and did not name him aloud. There are people who understand the power a name has. They keep them like knives, oiled and set to one side until there is a need. She nodded at Melisandre as if the 2 loaves were a trifle and left them to their path. In the ruined sept the beetle had been a knight once. He had a leg that had healed crooked. His hands had the fat knuckles of a man with a sort of peace with his own bones. He watched the jewel, and then he watched the young man's shoulder where the fabric pulled oddly, and then he set out bowls and said a few of the old words for courtesy. He had been a man who believed in the shape of certain stones. Now that shape had been hammered. He was too polite not to see what this new arrangement of the world might be. He did not ask for names. He swept a place for them with a willow broom and lit another fire, even though the day did not require one, and he did not mend his habit's ragged sleeve while they sat, as if to draw attention away from who lacked and who had been supplied. Robb sat on the floor with his back against a pillar whose carvings had been half worn away by generations of men touching them at shoulder height. He put his hand on the carved vine and thought about being a boy dragged into a god's presence to be told to look at the pattern something made after years and years of being the same thing. He remembered the first time his father had brought him to the heart tree in Winterfell and said nothing and expected him to learn what to do with a silence that was larger than a man. He had put his palm on the bark with it smooth underneath and felt foolish. Later, the fool feeling had gone. He had thought perhaps it would return now. It did not. He was too tired for foolishness. Melisandre talked to the beetle about saints and about a house where a woman had been watched by 3 men to see if she would die in the correct order, and the beetle nodded and told her about a door he had never been able to keep on its hinges and about fish that had risen in the flooded nave last spring as if to give confession. There are stories you trade when you are waiting to see if men will discover that a boy is still breathing when he should not. The afternoon wore itself thin. When the knock came, it came like a gentleman, 3 times, with a pause between each, and then once more as if the knocker wished to suggest politeness that nevertheless expected compliance. The beetle turned his head. Melisandre did not. She laid her fingers flat against the jewel. Robb did not reach for a sword that was not there. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes for the space of 2 breaths, and then he stood up. Outside, a cloak showed itself before the man did. It was fine but muddy at the hem, a phrased man who had had to step off the road. The face above it had the thin-boned stringiness of a man who had been handsome at 20 and hard at 30. He looked at Melisandre's throat first, and then at Robb, and then away quickly in the way men do when something has knocked all the small negotiations out of their heads. He had been sent to ask whether the rumor was a rumor and whether it might be possible to leverage it into something that would please his lord's brittle mouth. He had not expected to find his coalition of hopes presented with a living contradiction. He put a hand to the French knot on his sleeve and twisted the thread. "Good wife," he said to the beetle, because it made him feel better to put a person in their place with a word, even if the word wasn't the one for that person. "We look for," he faltered. The look Melisandre gave him was not a thing you can name. It was simply the look you offer a loose dog you do not intend to have trouble with. There are ways to own a man's muscles with your eyes. She practiced one, and the man's shoulders softened without his permission. "We are not sleeping men," she said, and there was nothing in the sentence but the reluctance to be disturbed. It came with the odd authority of someone who has already had this conversation at another time with a different man and learned that it can be won simply by offering no place to put the next line of the script. "We are people at a meal." The man grasped for a shape to fill the space her words left. He found his name and offered it like a coin. It was the wrong coin. She did not take it. He went a little red. He was not a bad man, only a weaker one. The kind who likes a day where he can be important and hates a day where he has to be clear about what sort of importance he wants. He looked again at Robb and his face did a private, violent thing. Realization followed by a calculation followed by prayer that was not to any god, but to the part of himself that might invent a lie right fast enough to save him from the truth he had just understood. He stepped back. He muttered something about the river being high. He left. Melisandre did not stand to bar the door or to set a charm. Not all preventions are useful. She let the man take the shape he had. She let him go and give the story the shape it wanted in his mouth. She sat down and put her hand to the jewel and found it had been cooler for an hour. She had not noticed when it cooled. That should have worried her. She did not have room for the worry. She looked at Robb and saw the way the hardness in his mouth had softened as if grief had found the place where exertion had put it down and had lifted it and cradled it as a woman will take the weight of a sleeping child without waking it. Because the weight is familiar even when the child is not hers. "Let him tell it," she said. "They'll think it a lie until someone else tells it again. Then they'll look for you in the wrong places first. Because men will go the way they despise before they go the way they fear." He nodded. He did not thank her. He did not yet dislike her enough to think that any courtesy attached to her was dangerous. He did not like her enough to speak gratitude. He took up the bowl of broth the beetle had set on the floor. He sipped. He thought of his mother as if her face were a carved thing in a place where vandals had done their best but the stone had kept something true. He thought of the north and of Stannis Baratheon and of the cold and the fire, as if they were two men standing already at the end of a field waiting for each other to begin the walk that would bring them to the place where they killed or were killed. He worked out where he would walk, not in a clean line, not to a single place, but in a set of curves that would bring him near a very old tree and a boy with a sword that might not be a sword at all, but a choice. Night came. He lay down again. He dreamed again. He dreamed of a room with red eyes carved in its wood. He dreamed of his wolf's breath and the empty space where a wolf's breath is supposed to be. He woke with a soundless flood of kneading that nearly knocked him off the pallet. He put his hand to his ribs and found the peace you find when the pain you expect is the pain you find and not a new one. Melisandre stood at the door. Her silhouette cut the light. She said to whatever stood outside, "No," and the night allowed itself to be told no in the tone that assumes compliance because it has been trained by fires that do not tolerate recalcitrance. She looked back and saw the young man press his palm to his chest and sleep again. She thought of what it had cost her. She thought of the first time she had laid a shadow along a man's bed and the curious shame she had felt afterward. Despite the fact that the men had earned the shadow. She felt no shame now. She felt a low, steady relief she could not disguise as piety if she tried. In the morning, they walked. The boatman came before dawn with the loaves from the mill, as promised, and with a chicken under his arm that he pretended to be annoyed with, though the amusement in him was evident. He had borrowed a cart with a wobbly wheel so that they might put Robb into it in the manner of a man too drunk to walk, which would draw less notice than a man too injured. He gave Melisandre the news that was news in the Riverlands. This man had taken this cow. That woman's boy had lost a hand for a loaf. That knight had given his spurs to a farmer for a bed in which to die. A girl had found a ring by the river and not put it on. He did not tell her what the great men had decided. The great men's decisions make a noise like thunder at a distance, and until the thunder comes near there is wind and leaves and the private sounds of private lives. They moved north and east by joints, not by straightness. They took the paths the brethren used and the ones used by men who did not have the nerve for such company but needed to avoid the roads now and then. Robb healed by inches. He learned how to sit without the knife in his chest insisting on itself. He practiced walking and accepted help when his knee tried to pretend to be something that was not a knee. He collected food from people who had sworn never to aid a grand person of any sort again and found that there are men and women who swore that and broke the oath for their own reasons. He told them no stories. He took what they gave and ate it and let the food be between them. Melisandre burned things at night and sometimes at dawn. Resin, a lock of hair that had not been hers. A small bone with a hole in it that had once held a charm and now held only the idea of what a charm's absence is like. She watched her fire and did not always tell him what she saw. He did not always ask. By the time he spoke his mother's name aloud to where it would stick in the world and not simply slab itself down in his chest. They were 3 days farther and the case around his pain had grown a thin shell. "Caitlin," he said when the night was the sort that creeps along the ground on its belly and steals warmth from anything foolish enough to let it. And Melisandre did not tell him that the river had taken his mother and that the river had not kept her. She said only, "She died bravely," and left the possibility of other sentences to be made later. "Gray wind," he said, and the name broke not like glass, which shatters, but like a piece of crockery, which gives you a shard that still looks like what it once was, and you can hold it and cut your thumb on it for the rest of your life. He slept with the shard in his fist. In the morning his fist bled where he had clutched too tight. He did not open his hand until the sun had had time to warm the backs of his fingers and turn them from stiff sticks into a tool a man can use. In a hamlet where the houses had been stripped for parts, they found a smith who had kept his hammer and his obstinacy. He set the young man's shoulder with a firmness that made the breath leave Robb's body in a single exploding, uncontrolled bark. "Better now than with a spear in it," the smith said, and Robb agreed with a politeness he had not had as a king. Melisandre paid the man in the sort of coin he would not be able to spend, favors, and in a bit of silver she had stitched into the hem of her dress. She had not thought to be generous in this life. It felt like a rashness and a luxury. She let herself have it for the hour and then tucked herself back into the harder shape she knew she would need. And then, one afternoon when the light had the particular quality that underlines edges and makes the world look as if a painter has gone round it with a narrow brush, the road chose them. Men on horses came around a copse one way and men on foot came the other. Melisandre could have charmed a few of them. She could have called a little heat and distracted them with the comfort of it. This was not a moment for charm. Robb had the wobbly wheel of the cart at his hand. He had a stick. He had the old trick that men who have learned how to command men have, the use of their eyes. He used those now. He lifted his head and he looked at the leader of the men on horseback and he made of himself a place a man might fall into whether he intended to or not. It was not majesty. Majesty had been tattered. It was habit. Habits endure. One of the men on foot, the kind of man who keeps one eye squinted and measures the weight of every word before he spends it, stopped very still and rubbed his face and then spat as if he could eject stubbornness along with the spittle. He looked at Robb and said nothing. Then he glanced at Melisandre and her jewel and he said even less. It was a moment that could have broken clean in any direction. The horses stamped. The footmen shifted the weight of their packs. Somewhere nearby a raven said something nasty about what men do with their right hands. The air tasted like the inside of a snow cloud. The man on the horse with the leader's jaw, who had been a boy once and had cried when his father beat a dog and learned not to do that again because his father's mouth had shaken afterward and the boy had hated the shaking more than he had hated the beating, dipped his chin the smallest amount. Melisandre saw it. Robb saw it. The other men saw it without knowing they had. "Road's yours," the man said. He might, later, tell himself that this had been a cleverness. A way to avoid trouble he didn't need for wages he was barely paid. In truth, he had felt something old pass through the space between the three of them. The woman with her stone, the man with the crook in his posture from a knife that had missed anything permanent by a thumb's breadth, the stubborn cart, and its hurt wheel, and he had made the sort of decision that men disguise from themselves as prudence. He took his horses off into the ditch without asking why the ditch should be his instead of the road, and the footmen followed and a small stream of ordinary life went on. Melisandre exhaled. She did not let herself smile. Robb did not look triumphant. He kept his head straight and his eyes ahead. He waited until they were around the corner, and then he added a pebble to the handful of the world's possibilities he had begun to carry again. He was not yet up to carrying the bigger stones. He would be, when at last they came to a village where there was a woman with hair gone iron gray at the temples who set a bowl down with the precise sort of politeness northern women prize. Where a boy peered from behind a door and thought men were stories. Where a dog came and set its chin on Robb's knee and looked up into his face, as if dogs sometimes inherit the parts of wolves men need in times like this. Robb let himself remember that Winterfell's walls would still be there to put his hand on. He did not ask whether they would take him. He had been taken by death and returned. That counts as being made by the world in a way that shifts what you think a wall owes you. He slept in that village in a loft above a cow and woke to the cow's breath and the smell of ammonia and straw and earth, and it felt more like life than any of the grander places he had slept since boyhood. He turned his face into the scratchy blanket and let his mouth find the place where tears had dried and felt the tightness there, and then damned it and rededicated himself in the dumb vow men make every morning to survive being themselves. At dawn, Melisandre stood at the edge of the yard and looked into a fire that was only a cooking fire. She saw the same things she would have seen at a sacred brazier because the world is not particular about where it places its signs. She saw a bear with a girl riding it as if it were a horse. She saw a white road that disappeared into a white world and a black blade that remembered names it had been given by men who had not died holding it. She saw Robb's face, older, not by years but by the accrual of understandings that are like small stones in a pack. She saw Stannis's mouth harden and soften again in a thing close to generosity. She saw the cold. She went back into the house. Robb was awake and sitting on the edge of the pallet in the posture of a man who has been up an hour and surveying what his body will allow. He looked at her and did not ask what she had seen. He said, "North," and the word was at once a place and a decision and a prayer. "Yes," Melisandre said. She thought of all the ways a yes can be a trap and a rescue both. She did not tell him that north also means snow and hunger and a wall and the dark that might be gathered on the far side of it. He knew these things. He had been born with them in the water he drank. She said, "North," again because sometimes a word wants to be said twice, once to the inside of you and once to the world. They went together from the yard and down the lane and out past the place where the Waynwoods had once sent their men and where no men came now, their unheard thunder lost to other fields. A boy ran in from the road and told a girl that he had seen a king in a cart, and the girl laughed because boys say things. The dog who had put his head on Robb's knee lay down and put his head on his paws and watched them go and lifted it when they did not look back. Above them, two crows quarreled. The sky above the crows had the pale, indifferent blue of a water kept behind ice. In the distance, somewhere he had not yet decided how to reach, a tree lifted its red leaves into a wind the men here did not feel, and made the sound old things make when they are asked to last a little longer.